Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSPmagazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
All right, enough chatting behind the scene. We have to get on stage. I
think we've recorded 2 podcasts at this point.
We're not Guns N' Roses that we can make people wait.
We never press the red button
for an hour before rolling in. Thank you, Axel, for making me wait so many times. Okay, here we are, Redefining Society podcast. Once upon a time, tomorrow. We sometimes lose somebody on the way. Today is Carey. We don't know in what part of the world
he's already in tomorrow.
It's already in tomorrow. So maybe we'll catch up with him as we go.
Exactly.
He's time traveling ahead of us.
I was just rewatching. I'm doing like an Harry Potter marathon, actually. And there is at a certain point, the Prisoner of Azkaban, where they have the time traveling episode. And it's pretty cool. Only way that Hermione can take multiple lessons is just go jump back and forth in time, so she can take more lessons. I would have done the opposite when I was a kid. I would have skipped. Exactly. I would have used the time travel tool to skip the lesson completely, not to take more lessons. It's like, get me out of here. Anyway, it's already a good start. We're talking about weird stuff. Rafael and Sean and myself and Carey, wherever you are, we hope you're having a good time. So what do we talk about is we don't know. We've been trying to decide because there is so much that we can talk about. Many fascinating things happening in the world of technology. But I think we are very excited when we meet the 4 of us to talk about entertainment. We talk about music, we talk about videos, movies. Usually AI comes into place. Carey and I talk about privacy. That was a little bit less related to entertainment, but on social media. And today we're curious. We want to take advantage of Rafael and his knowledge of all the video game industry and world, and it's not necessarily anymore my cup of tea. I think the last game I played was Myst a long time ago. But I don't know, Sean, aren't you curious to know where we're standing with virtual reality, metaverse, touching things that are not there, optics?
I was just thinking Pong. I was trying to remember. Did you actually get haptic feedback in Pong? Was there ever a version that had that?
No, but I do that when I play tennis. I get a real good feedback, or paddle, ping pong.
I'll give you some feedback.
The real one. I don't think there was that back in the days. Could you have done that, Rafael? Could you have had on Pong in the 70s, the 80s, whenever that was?
No. I back in the day with Pong, we were happy just to have 2 dials and little lines that moved back and forth.
That was exciting.
Yeah, that was the beginning. Was 2 lines that could move back and forth, and a few pixels for a ball, and we were fascinated.
Why do you think that is? I was just wondering. I mean, why would we not go outside to play? Now, maybe there might be weather reasons or whatever, but it might be dark. But what would 2 lines in a box bouncing around do to us that keeps us attracted to it?
So I think part of it is that, I mean, we're tool users. We like making constructions. We're humans as primates, as monkeys. We like to sit down and make things with our hands and then go like, look at that. I love going to the Musée Mécanique in downtown San Francisco, over by the Fisherman's Wharf, that has old, not just old video games and old arcade games, but like the original kind of notion of an arcade game where they were mechanical constructions. And that's the thing, is like, if you roll back to that, like even before we could do things that were electronic, we were doing mechanical constructions, because while it was good to have bigger things that we could wander around and look at, the notion of a skee ball or an air hockey table, or just, throwing a dart, those things got kind of compartmentalized into mechanical constructions, because humans like to play. That notion of play is core to games, and it's oftentimes, can you give people guidelines or kind of a signpost for what the play is? And that's really what Pong is. It's going, okay, we're going to take this core notion that you understand from tennis or ping pong, and we're going to bring it over here. And part of it is we're fascinated then by that abstraction of going like, oh, okay, now it looks like this, and I have to do it in this particular way. And then there's the challenge of doing it.
Makes sense. Funny story. Sean and I, every time we go to San Francisco, usually for RSA conference, we make a stop in that museum. And we have some serious games of pinball. And
nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
There's some weird stuff in there too, I have to say.
Oh, there's some weird stuff.
There is. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is, like some of it is, you have like the games of weight where you've got to, hit a hammer on a thing. And some of it is just the equivalent of like a kaleidoscope where you're just looking at something. But there's the realization, that those early kaleidoscope things, some of those were analogous to, to that notion of a penny arcade. You drop a penny and you get to look at something, and it might be something risque or shocking or banal, but it's a distraction. And that's another form of play.
I'm gonna throw another thing here that came in my mind, because now I am visually in my head inside the arcade, and there is a fortune tellers like you see in the movie Big, right? And you have the horse racing, you have a lot of things, and then you get ahead of time, and you have the game that I used to play, the Atari game, the video games in the bar and the arcade, the little cars that go around, they're still pixel, right? But you got the wheel. And I'm thinking the magic element of this, we like to play game, but I think the idea that, if you want to still talk about Pong, that you are actually able to move with a little mechanism and the something that is not physical. It's in a video, it's in the TV. And you don't understand exactly how it works, but it's fascinating. It's almost magic. So,
yeah. It's a suspension of disbelief. Like one of those racing games that they have, and it's funny because it's working in reverse, is one where, they've got a little physical toy car that's right in front of you that doesn't actually move except to shift back and forth slightly to show its angle, and then they've got a physical scrolling screen, like effectively before the notion of pixels and TVs. You've got a scrolling, like painted screen that comes in front of the car, so that the car is supposed to move to that screen. Mm-hmm. It's all about that suspension of disbelief. It's creating an illusion, and if anything, it ties in a way to bits of vaudeville and theater. And it's this notion of we're going to put on entertainment. It's a presentation. It's in front of you, and we're going to use whatever tools we currently have to make that. The notion that our current mediums of TV and animation and film and music and games all come out of how can we entertain each other.
And it reminds me of another game that I don't know if I ever had it. I have one now because I went back to get it went and bought it. The Coleco Norelco football game, where you kind of knew how I was going to go, and you'd reach a certain point, and I wasn't very good at it, so I'd always bomb out fairly early. But even still, it's just little dots on the screen. Granted, I'm hand holding it now, but it's little dots. There's a little bit of sound, and even if I sucked at it, I was mesmerized, right? And it's not like a computer screen or a television screen where something's projected. It's just little dots. But even still, it took me, to your point, took me away and into a different place, right? Where that's what I was thinking about. Whatever's on my mind before is out. I'm just worried or trying to figure out how do I move my thumbs fast enough in the right way in anticipation to avoid these dots and get my pass off to the receiver.
Sean is using the imagination. I mean, now I go back to when we were kids, we will be fascinated by Formula One. We will draw with the chalk on the floor a circuit from a Formula One, and then with the caps of bottles, we will just flip them around, and those were the cars. And then you just kick the cup around, and I remember there were hours of fun just by doing that. We knew that they were not Formula One car. It wasn't Ferrari, it wasn't Renault, but who cares? We were having just a good time, and we were projecting ourselves in there. Now, just to jump in our modern day, it seems like in order for us to really do these things, and I don't know today's kids, but when I start thinking about virtual reality, is it because we can't use that imagination anymore, or is it because it's just bring it to a completely new level of abstraction and make it more real?
I think that we have a wider range now. And yeah, I mean, I grew up, I grew up playing with, Star Wars action figures. I was part of that generation where I saw Star Wars in the theater and then was basically like, I want those. And, my brother and I played and, set up, elaborate, stories and battles and things with our collected, Star Wars and G.I. Joe action figures. And in that era, was going to the arcades back in Seattle, and I loved going to the arcade and just kind of exploring what was there and seeing all of the potential. As the game industry has grown and we've had this range of expression from PC to console to mobile to VR and bits of early AR, at the same time, we have this greater and greater fidelity, and you can look at like Call of Duty or similar, and you have 100 million plus budgets and all this attempt. Spider-Man 2 just came out, and I think 2 days ago, and it's probably going to be one of the biggest games of the year, and it looks like a movie. But at the same time, keep in mind that the biggest game in the world right now is Minecraft. Minecraft has 1 billion people playing it,
which doesn't look like a movie.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that or Roblox. Like Roblox, it's increasing the fidelity and what the engine can do, but there's a contingent within Roblox that always likes the classic, what they call Bloxy style, and it's part of the same reason that people still love Minecraft, and Minecraft is still one of the most popular games, is because you can invest your imagination in it, and sometimes it's useful. Like it's good to kind of think back to characters that can be iconic. You look at Mario and you look at the beginning of Mario, and it's this character with a cap. Like you have this tiny array of pixels, and it's just a character with a cap and a mustache and kind of portly and overalls. There's an iconicism when you have simplicity in presentation that makes that oftentimes carry much longer ahead. For a Mario or a Sonic or other characters of that era. And it's part of why you sometimes still have people making things in that style, that kind of 8-bit style, because they understand that there's something elemental about that.
Is it Is that science or is it nostalgia, or both? Do we know? Is it just that's the brand, so we keep using it and people love it and new generations?
It's partially nostalgia. Like, Roblox has been around since 2005. There are now folks who literally grew up playing Roblox, so they like that bloxy style. Minecraft debuted in 2009, but I think that it's more than that. That I think that with a bunch of our entertainment, we're finding that there are different styles and kind of different fidelities, where animation, for example, can be much more detailed, but you still have points where people specifically make a cruder animation style. South Park could have evolved and got more detailed, but it works just the way it is. It's kind of funnier to have the characters be crude than not.
Another example I give you is Halloween just went by. I don't know when I'm going to publish this, but I'm not really good at publishing lately. But Halloween was 2 days ago, and it's a classic for me to watch The Nightmare Before Christmas, Tim Burton. I have to. It's my thing. And when you look at it now, it's already old in a way. So it's that clay animation, or the movement that when you look at behind the scene, you literally have to move one piece of the arm, change the expression. It's a tedious thing to do. Like animation before computers, it was tedious, redesigning, drawing, every single action. I mean, Disney itself was obsessed with the fluidity of the image. It wasn't about jumping from one position to another. It was everything in between. But for me, when I look at that, I like the fact that it's kind of clumsy. I don't need that perfection. And as another example, when I don't know if you remember the Polar Express, when Tom Hanks was playing the train chief guy, and they pick up all the kids to go to the Polar, and it was one of the first, I think, where they were really giving that 3D effect to the character, and people freaked out about that. They were like, wait a minute, this is going too real. This is not, I can't really classify it as animation, but it's not a movie, so it's kind of weird. And I'm wondering again if there is a place and time for that or the other. Maybe we need both. Maybe sometimes we do need to use our imagination a little bit more, and we can play with something that we need to connect the dots. Another time, maybe I haven't seen the Spider movie, but kind of sounds good and cool that I can play like if it was a real movie.
Right.
I don't know. I probably like both. That's my point.
Yeah, and I think it's like, I think the best way to think of it is that we have a broader palette now than we did before, and we kind of don't want to put the older paints away. We want all of those, and so you do have, so like, just by contrast, Avatar 2, I consider to be an animated movie. You will have a hard time finding a single frame in Avatar 2 that is not 51% CGI or more. The reality is that there was a lot of actual filming, but they layered over it so much that it's basically an animated movie. But at the same time, while you have this high fidelity, complex animated CGI, one of my favorite animated shows right now is Star Trek: The Lower Decks. And Star Trek: The Lower Decks is a comedy, and it's not the only animated. There's also Prodigy, which is a little bit more for kids. Star Trek: The Lower Decks, they could have made as a full-on Star Trek live action series. I think that they intentionally aimed it as an animated series because they wanted to make a Star Trek comedy where they took the red shirt ensigns and did a show about, kind of all the junior cadets screwing up and making jokes and cracking wise at each other. But it kind of works better to have that be animated, both so that they can have the occasional, crazy alien thing without blowing their budget, but also because they can have, like, you're used to seeing wacky hijinks and crazy jokes from things like Looney Tunes. It makes sense. And Star Trek: The Lower Decks, even though it's tonally different, it feels similar in some ways to something like Rick and Morty. And you just go, okay, these are adult animation shows. They're not really made for kids. Kids can potentially watch them, but there's a lot of hidden in-jokes. Star Trek: The Lower Decks actually now is very heavily lore-based and makes tons of references to things all over Deep Space Nine and The Next Generation. So it's not just like a full-on comedy. It's trying to be a serious show that's also a comedy. And it works better for being an adult animated show than if it was, like, the comedy works better, and it's in some cases easier to do than if they filmed it live action.
Mm.
And so as we were talking here, I'm thinking we're not all one person, right? So we're all unique and like different things, dislike different things. But at any moment in time, we are different ourselves, right? We might be in a good mood, a bad mood, upset, in love, whatever, right? So you just pick an emotion or pick a current state and a desired state, and that may decide or determine what we want to do next and how we search for and absorb different types of entertainment. And so how are we, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, do we have the ability to create stuff that adapts to all of those different nuances, different audiences in a broad way, or because we have technology? Whereas maybe in the past, a certain type of comedy delivered in a certain way, you're gonna limit your audience to a subset of humanity, right? Just they're not going to resonate with it. It's not the tone of the times, so it's not going to fit a particular audience. So, do we have a better chance now of being more dynamic to align with all of us?
Yes, and it's like some at some points people will talk about, like, the rise of genre fiction. I think that a lot of it is, like, historically, if you look at film and TV, we've always had genre fiction. You can go back to westerns or gangster movies, but there's a range of fantasy and science fiction and superheroes that we didn't have a good way to illustrate in film and TV. We could in animation, but it was a lot harder to bring them into live action. And frankly, it was often harder to bring them and illustrate them well, even in games, until we got the ability to render parts of them on screen, whether it was pre-rendered or real-time rendered. But it does feel like we have a wider range of expression. In some cases, that people who weren't as willing to, let's say, digest science fiction as when it was a book that they needed to read, or a magazine. Like I used to read, Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, and they would have fantastic short stories. That reached a niche audience, but then it becomes Black Mirror, and a great many more people will watch Black Mirror than will read a science fiction magazine. It becomes more accessible when genre fiction that needs illustration to showcase parts of the imagination then goes into film and TV, because we can paint new pictures.
I love it. I was picturing the Slee Stack. I don't know if you remember that It's very, very realistic. The sleeve stack. Seems like maybe we lost Marco's camera, but
No, I'm here. I don't know what happened.
yeah, it's a much better view now. That's all
I know. Let's just leave the little thing. I don't know. You know, this is funny because it seems like I've done it on purpose.
He looks more svelte.
I think I've done it on purpose. Okay.
There you go.
No, it's not there. But this kind of helps me to make a point while I'll talk while I try to figure out this thing. So not everybody is the same. As Sean said. Oh, look, I'm back. So some people like to, or maybe they can use their visual imagination more than other. Like some people see things when people talk. When I listen to a story, that's why I listen to Audible a lot, or I read. I don't just read. I see stuff, right? So what I'm saying here is that some people may prefer consume something in a different way. And I think the point of the movie is that you're representing a reality already when it's there. And I think we had this conversation in the past where if you say, this is Sean's favorite story, it was a dark and stormy night, there's a lot of way to represent that. And yeah, this was a conversation we had with Carey and Rafael. But once you picture in your mind, there could be lighting, there could be other things, there could be, where is the location? Are there mountains? Or is this in a city? I mean, you don't say that with that sentence. But the moment that a director put it in a scene or in a painting and you visualize it for other, you actually see it and everybody sees the same way. Now, I personally don't like that much. I like to see shit in my head. But I think that the fact that the Black Mirror may have captured more people than ITSPmagazine, I can see this to be the point. And another one, Dungeons and Dragons. I just had a conversation with this guy, a fantastic storyteller. He creates these events for the community, the neurodiverse community. So he created these events so where everybody's at ease and maybe people that normally wouldn't express themselves very well. He plays the master in the Dungeons and Dragons, and the kids start opening themselves and understanding and participating and telling the story. And that is just by moving the Dungeons and Dragons pieces. And there is not you couldn't achieve that, what I'm saying, with a video game, probably. So maybe for everything and everybody, depending on the situation, it's good to have all this variety of storytelling technique that we can use.
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to jump on that specifically with Dungeons and Dragons because, that's near and dear to my heart. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons as a kid back in Seattle, where my parents sent me to summer camp one year, and I think I was about 7, 8, and one of the older kids at the summer camp organized, it's like basically, here we're going to play Dungeons and Dragons. I was like, what's that? And it was done as around the camp, like literally around the campfire, where it was an interactive storytelling session. The kid hadn't brought his rule books and his dice, but what he did was he boiled it down to its most elemental parts, where he was the dungeon master, the game master, and he told us a story, and we were literally around the fire, around the campfire, and he explained the basics of like, okay, you're going to be this character, you're going to be that character, and so like we immediately got kids understand role playing right away, because and the notion of like, okay, you're going to role play an adult, a big person, like you get that as a kid. Kids do dress up, and you're like, okay, now I'm going to be an adult, and so like the notion of like, okay, I'm we're going into a movie together and you're telling us and we get to talk about what we do. That notion of interactive storytelling, purely using our imagination, where he didn't even have, the dice or any figurines or anything other than his words, I got immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And just after, and I connected that into another thing that I experienced early on, which was that my father was a music professor, and he would periodically have a Ghanaian master drummer come up from Portland, and he would organize concerts through the Seattle Arts Commission. And so a family friend was a master drummer named Obo Ade. And Obo would go and perform. My dad would usually film it, and then he would come back to the house and hang out, before driving back to Portland, maybe the next day. And he would always tell us stories. He would tell us stories of like Anansi the Spider and others, but he would tell us Ghanaian folktales. And but it wasn't just, he understood at a core the notion of call and response. When he was telling us stories, myself and my brother, he would ask us questions and he would incorporate that in. And it was very clear the correlation between folktales done in a traditional African style and Dungeons and Dragons boiled down to its basic elements of, I say something, what do you want to do? Okay, let me incorporate that in. Let me change the story a little bit, allow it to grow, and it builds in the imagination more. And the storyteller keeps the attention of the audience by that call and response, and by incorporating things, and by growing it together. It becomes a conversation. Games have that at a core. It's just a question of, do they paint in 8-bit? Do they paint in, a early 16 or 32-bit? Do they paint in, 4K? There's a range of detail that they can have, but and if anything, like, we've gotten used to different stylizations, and we've got comfortable that they are locked in. We have literary genres, but we also have expressions of particular style. You go like, this is stop motion, this is 8-bit. For animation, you go like, oh, I want to see something that looks like Wallace and Gromit. I want to see the physicality of that, and I care about it, and I want to hear a story in that world of Wallace and Gromit or Chicken Run. And it feels right because you see the physicality and you see the lighting on the models, and you know that they're physically real. Mm. You can look at a style of one thing or another, or an old arcade game in 2D, and you can go, I'm immersed in that world and I'm fully in it. I'm invested. I have that suspension of disbelief, whether it's stop motion. It can be Enter the Spider-Verse and it's crazy 3D with shaders, or it can be stop motion with simple clay models, but you go into that world. But at its core, it's storytelling. Someone sat down in front of you in a bedroom, at a campfire, in a living room, and said, let's weave a story together. That's something that I always carry with me, is that anytime that we're making entertainment, we're weaving stories.
So I want to. So let's assume it's a phenomenal story, but I want to experience that story in a different way. I feel like we're approaching a time where I can turn a dial. I want to see this story in 8-bit and with mono speakers, or I want to dial it up to 8K. With Dolby. I don't know what the highest Dolby is now at this point, but all the way up at the other end from an audio perspective as well. And I feel that the technology is like right there. I mean, we see it we can take some audio piece and translate it in different languages. We can take a sample image and translate that into different styles of a picture. And it's nothing new, right? We've taken full color frame photos and made them black and white or sepia to get a different feeling for the same image, right? So are we at a point where we'll be able to choose the experience, not just the story?
Choose your own story.
Choose your own adventure.
Oh, there's that too.
We have some of that, and that's the thing, is we have some of that right now, but it's not a thing, like it's an intentional choice that has to be made by the developers. So like a good example is there's a classic game called Karateka. It's an old school game. And I think they've actually done this with Karateka and Prince of Persia, where you could basically tap and toggle buttons back and forth to go between the original graphics and the updated graphics, where they have the classic of those games from the 80s, and then they did effectively like a Criterion collection for Karateka, so that you have like the original early 80s version, you have the modified 2020s version, and you can even just like this one, that one, this one, that one, back and forth, just to sort of see the same thing in motion and see that notion of like, what does a new modern paint over that's still in 2D look like compared to that original thing. In a slightly different vein, there's a classic 90s pre-rendered FMV game called Seventh Guest. The Seventh Guest was kind of around the same time as like Myst and Phantasmagoria. They just remade Seventh Guest as a VR game, and so it's very much someone has to sit down and build it, and that's not a case of going back and forth. That's there was an FMV game that I think came on 6 CDs, and then you have this remake that now is you put a headset on and you walk around in it, and you walk around in that same mansion.
Let's reconnect the dots. We started with virtual reality. We never really got into that, and we went, of course, all the way back. So let's connect that. So nowadays, you just brought an example of you put your virtual reality goggle, you walk inside the environment, you can maybe toggle between one style and another. What else can you do now with the actual gloves? And what is your feeling, your sensation? Is it also, I'm curious, it's becoming more accessible, or are we looking at the $3,000 Apple to be
Yeah, so we're still in a period of growth. Like the way that I often try to describe it to people is that 2D, we've gotten to the point of where we've really mastered two-dimensional graphics. We can show anything that we want to. In 3D, we can actually show almost anything that we want to. The Enter the Spider-Verse movie, just as a movie, is so mind-blowingly past something like Toy Story, because it's a 3D movie, but you've got all of this visual effect and shader work, and it looks like as he's moving around in different parts of kind of a multiverse that there are different styles, like they go into different worlds and they have different rendering styles. We could draw that as a comic 30 years ago, but we couldn't even think of building that. So in this kind of XR realm of like VR and AR, we're still kind of in the 8-bit era. That's probably the best way to think of it, is that XR needs another 30 years. Now in games, we've gone from, Pong to Mario to Super Mario 64 to, crazy Call of Duty and Fortnite. But in XR, we've still got these small productions. And even where we're doing 3D, it's still like the best way to think of a lot of the VR stuff is that it's still kind of the equivalent of Toy Story. The things that we're going to make 30 years from now will probably be, virtual cities, or, things of complexity that we can just barely understand, in the same way that, like, you look at Toy Story back in, I think it was 1996, and you go from Toy Story to, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and it's not just night and day. It's this spectrum of growth that takes a long time to get to. Right now we have these headsets that, you can have a mobile processing and battery, and or you can run it on a PC. But you look back at VR, like NASA stuff from the JPL, back in the 80s, and it's these very clunky things with big wires, and it's basically just like, it's broadcasting a simplified version of a TV onto your head, and it's not really doing any head tracking or any haptics or any of that. We could just barely make a thing back then, and now we've got things where you can put something on your head and we can do hand tracking, which is kind of magical. Or like the Quest 3, you can basically tap a button and you can go from looking at VR to looking at a pass-through camera with some distortion correction, and you can go like, okay, let me double check the world around me. We couldn't even imagine that. Like, we have papers that talk about that from 92 that talk about like VR, virtual reality, and augmented reality and mixed reality, but we have this really hazy notion of what mixed reality was. What I will say, lastly, just to wrap it up, is that haptics is a good area where the most advanced haptics are actually in things like the PlayStation 5 controller. It's doing like really finely detailed rumble in things like the Spider-Man 2 PlayStation 5 game. There's a lot of actual mechanical miniaturization work that we need to do in haptics. Haptic gloves that are actually really good for giving you sensory feeling are probably like 50 years away, because we need to create like little nano machines in there. We focused on the visuals more than anything. We have a bit more work to do in terms of 3D audio, but we're just starting to look at touch and hand tracking, and we don't even know how to do things like smell and taste. So XR is very early.
Maybe a good idea after all.
Yeah, that's get
Can you imagine, Sean, that the virtual pizza?
I know. I'll leave that in the real one. Just a quick thought, and I don't remember when or where I picked this up, but I have this notion that at one point all of this was going to be on systems, all of this, whatever it is we're talking about, stuff presented to us audio visually, would be on some systems in locations that we were going to, where you'd have a special wall that would give you these experiences. It seems like we've taken a turn to we're bringing the devices to us and wearing it on our head. But remember last time, I think we talked about the Sphere a bit in Las Vegas. And so I was just recalling that in the context of this. And because I thought at one point you're going to go to places to experience things, not necessarily inside in an arena or an auditorium, but perhaps even just along the street. Right? So I don't know. Do you see that still happening, or?
Not honestly, not so much. So yeah, like I can literally roll back in my head to where I was back in the 90s, had read Snow Crash somewhat recently, and I was working at Looking Glass on the Thief games, and we were doing early 3D, and we knew about how much we could do with 3D and kind of where that would go. And I would, working in Cambridge, would go from, on the weekends into Cybersmith, and Cybersmith had a VR setup, and you could go and you could, put on a headset and you had a little kind of pod around you. And there were times, playing with that and thinking about what the future of VR would be. And this was probably in about, maybe 98. And, like playing with 3D glasses. And there was a sense that VR was expensive and that it would probably be a thing where you would go to a theater, and that, that, like, I can literally remember having a dream about building VR games for theaters, and the notion that people would go to either like a seated or standard pod, and you'd have like 100 people. And my thought then was like, it could get to the point where you could create a murder mystery, and 100 people could go into that, and they'd all be milling around, and it would be something like, Murder on the Orient Express, but everybody would, go into the theater to experience a VR movie that they would get to live through together, and that they would need to go into pods to do that because the electronics would be too expensive for everyone to have them at home. But that was before the days of, that was in the days of when laptops were like weighed about as much as like a textbook, like a biology textbook, and where nobody had phones in their pockets. Now we have an expectation that the computing experience can eventually be brought down to where whatever it is, we can wear it, an Apple Watch, a phone in your pocket, a thing on your head. But there's an understanding and an expectation that there should be a consumer version of that thing that's probably somewhere between $400 and $1,000 that you can take home with you. That didn't used to be the case. Back in the 80s, I went to an arcade and we had BattleTech pods in Seattle, and like 4 massive pods, and they were like 10 feet long, and you went and you sat in one, and they were networked together on a custom network because that was how you could play a multiplayer thing. Now everyone's like, okay, I've got a few computers at home and a PS5 and an Xbox and a this and a that, and I've got a Steam Deck back there and a Switch downstairs, and we're used to having all of these electronic devices that can do different ranges of things. We couldn't imagine that back in the 90s. Back then it was just like, yeah, we have computers, but like there's all this other stuff that you're going to have to go to a location because it's going to be so expensive that you never imagined you could have it at home. And now we do.
Now we do.
And that's one of those changes in society that I always try to talk about. Like, is it still real? If we get together with people in a virtual world, in the metaverse, and we interact with them with our own goggles, and we don't need to be physically together, is that really not good? Is it not real? Because my point is that it's real. If I'm doing it, either I'm doing it virtual or there, and I'm having these emotions and feelings from a philosophical perspective and psychological too, for me is real. A lot of people will disagree in person, and we can talk about events and all of that. So I think this is a good conversation to have longer than this, because it's but it was interesting to reflect a moment in my head as I wrapped this conversation, the fact that there should be room for all of this. We're always presenting in a way that is just, the new is coming and the old is going. And I think the new is coming and it's just layering up on the old. And then as we do ourselves, we just go back and feel nostalgic about a certain thing, and we go to play pinball games at the arcade. And yes, we could be doing a metaverse immersion, and we're probably going to do both. Sometimes I may want to play with some music on a digitally, and other time I'd rather hurt my fingers on on the bass, on the guitar. So the good news is that there is all of this. And the news many times is presented to, oh, this is the new, and the old is going to disappear. I don't think so. I hope not.
Yeah, and that's the thing is you make space for new experiences, and we're still in many cases trying to understand how those fit together. Like, if I roll back to, let's say, 2008, there's a point where Guitar Hero and Rock Band as video game experiences were big, playing with plastic instruments. One of the things, and actually for a few years after that, one of the things I really love, and I'd love to see it come back, is one thing that Rock Band did really well. Like it's not that you're playing music, it's karaoke, but it's a form of group karaoke. We would gather folks together and we would play Rock Band, and actually even into the last decade, where it becomes about this four-player living room karaoke, where you can switch back and forth, but you can basically go, there's guitar, bass, drums, and actually up to 3 mics as well. Like I loved playing Rock Band Beatles and singing Beatles songs, but the notion that that it could even track harmonies, and that we could have 3 of us harmonizing together while we're trying to do a particular song, and everybody can kind of do it to their own skill level. This is part of what video games are starting to get into, where you can go, it doesn't have to be just like run around and shoot things. There's new forms of play that we're constantly finding, and being able to role play as the Beatles became one of them, where, it's not like, one person is George and one person is Ringo, but you go, we're going to role play doing a song together. And that becomes a new means of play and expression that wouldn't have been possible in that same way, 10 or 20 years prior. We keep finding new ways. And like, so I'll throw something out there. One area that I'd love to be able to go into, and I know that it's still fairly complex to get to, but one thing that's on my bucket list is immersive theater. Immersive theater would be a fantastic thing to take into games. And I'm convinced it would work best in VR, but that we need time for the VR hardware market to grow. But if you think of immersive theater, San Francisco has the Speakeasy, and New York and Chicago have others. The core notion of immersive theater, just to take that particular form of entertainment, is to have a series of actors who are moving back and forth effectively like NPCs. You have the audience that are the player characters that have the agency to go around and observe. And then you have the NPCs, which are the actors. And you have an expansive space for them to move around in. And the players don't know the story or necessarily where they can go, and they need to explore and look around. Their agency is largely their movement. They mostly can't go, and they're not supposed to interact with the actors and change the story, because that's a whole other level of thing. And the Star Wars Galactic Cruiser was trying to get into this, but it like that was pushing it into resort and hotel territory. But immersive theater is really just, let's have a complex nonlinear story for about 2 hours and let people explore it from any vantage point that they want to. That's a thing that can technically be done in games, but you need to run it on a server, and you need to have ideally some amount of cloud support for running a lot of AIs at the same time. And it can be run in 3D, but it would be better in VR. And the tricky thing is that it's not really a game. It's entertainment. But that's an example to me of part of the future of entertainment is you have an interactive story that people can explore, whether it's something like immersive theater or, thinking back to the notion of people going into pods in a theater and going into a murder mystery, but, which is also kind of existence. If you remember David Cronenberg's existence, having something that has branching and immersive or nonlinear narrative and allowing people to go into that is something that we're just on the cusp of being able to do, because it needs to be a multiplayer experience. And a lot of our past multiplayer, whether it's like an MMO or an FPS, is like, we can just barely render this stuff and do some really simple activity together. Shoot each other or collect loot or, whack things Diablo style. We're now getting to the point of where we can go, we can have some actors and we can mocap them and we can have complex situations and we can run 20 to 40 actors all at the same time that are all moving around and keep track of where they are. There's a lot of potential for virtual worlds, never mind like get into a massive virtual city, but just to go, can we have a nonlinear narrative and have people explore it? We couldn't do that before a few years ago.
Yeah, I liken it to the silent disco, where you have multiple DJs feeding up, let's say 3 DJs feeding 3 tracks. So you have different pockets of people in an area, each in their own space, presumably with each other. Everybody on red is listening to the same, bouncing at the same beat. But I've been to one where they've actually planted people in to get people to dance and to do different things, do the train around or do the YMCA in a certain way or whatever. And so that's the real world version of that in my mind. So it's not linear, right? But somebody's kind of controlling the scenes. You can come in and out of different scenes, interact with each other in that scene, and then potentially others coming in and making you feel and do different things. So add the virtual visual stuff on there, and that sounds like what you described.
Sounds like nuts.
It is nuts. If you don't have a headset on, you're like, what the heck's going on?
Beautifully nuts.
Well, as you're presenting this theater and even now the individualized, we talk about individual personalized finance. Everything is personalized. It sounds to me we're going into personalized entertainment where you can choose exactly the one that you want. I'm wondering if what people will choose, if they will choose wisely or not. And I don't know, a lot to think about. So I'm going to call this off at 58 minutes. I had some technology issue with the internet, and I'm wondering if I can even have a regular video and audio. How am I going to be in a virtual world and actually enjoy it 100% of the time? And now the question is, if you die in the virtual world, do you actually die in the real world as well?
You have to escape first before you die.
Does it count? Do we have multiple lives like in a video game? Play again?
You just have to collect 1-up mushrooms.
Talk to Mario. Talk to Mario.
I'm going to leave you guys with an amusing anecdote here.
Okay.
Heineken back in spring 2022, at the height of kind of the Metaverse craze, and this like shows that they were trying to understand it. They were making fun of it. They knew that this stuff was kind of half-baked. So they did a promotion in this thing called Decentraland, which was a, kind of early Web3 thing that was still trying to find an audience. So Heineken did this thing where they set up a promotion for their Heineken Silver brew. And the tagline was that the metaverse is not the best place to taste a new beer. And so you could go into Decentraland and you could get a Heineken Silver, and you could, quote unquote, drink it. And they made fun of the fact that you couldn't actually drink it. and their other tagline was no calories, no hidden ingredients, and no beer. So that, they stressed that you could go to the launch party and you could have pixelated lobster and caviar, and you could have virtual beer. And they absolutely made fun of the fact that they were giving you a virtual beer that you could pretend to drink and that you could not taste at all.
But if you actually had to pay something for that non-beer, then then they made something interesting. Or maybe even collect a credit after you drink a virtual beer for a real beer at the store. That could be another marketing idea.
You had to pay for a beer that you couldn't drink.
And that's going to be the end of this. Everybody think about that. Go outside, take a walk, smell the flower, because they ain't going to be able to do that in the virtual world anyway. And enjoy life, but also enjoy technology, because it's still life as well. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Carey. You really made a lot of sense today in this conversation. Glad that Carey was on.
He didn't say anything controversial.
Well done.
Carey had some deep thoughts.
All right, everybody. As usual, we had a lot of fun. I hope you did as well. Stay tuned, subscribe, and share. Share with other people if you enjoy this, and leave us comment maybe to talk about this any other time, because sometimes we don't know what to talk about, and then we ended up talking for an hour and 2 minutes. So goodbye. Take care, everybody.
Good night. Good night.
Indeed.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSPmagazine with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.